Cheerilee made her way through the backstage area, albeit a good distance away from the whole snails thing, and headed for the dressing room. After the scene with Sweetie Belle, 2 soliloquy scenes followed, one with Reginald and then the other with the king. Since she took her sweet time, that first one had almost certainly ended already. But as the mayor passed a few corridors leading up to the stage itself, she thought she could hear Apple Bloom's voice on stage. If she hurried, she might still be able to assist Snips in finding his costume for the last scene, if he was indeed as dumb as he looked and hadn't been able to find it on his own yet. As she rounded a corner, something crashed into her at high speed, causing her to stumble back a few steps as the air got slammed out of her lungs. She looked down when she got her bearings and saw Snips sitting there on his plot, shaking his head to dispel the dizziness that set on due to the crash. "Snips, what are you doing here? And not even in costume! You need to get ready for the last scene," she said by way of a reprimand. The scion colt with the outre mane looked hugely relieved to see his teacher, and he immediately scrambled to his feet, tears in the corner of his eyes as he started talking. "Oh, Miss Cheerilee, it's terrible!" he yelled out. "I was looking for my costume, and I couldn't find it, so I went looking for you, and I couldn't find you, but I found snails, and... He took a deep breath at this point, obviously struggling to get the words out. "And he's dead." Cheerilee's world grinded to a halt at those words, cold sweat breaking out across her forehead as she felt the slightest hint of panic rise up from her stomach like bile. She'd strayed from her schedule, and she'd just found out what would come to cost her. Her mind worked frantically to figure out a way to minimize the damage caused, to somehow soothe the colt enough so that her plans would go through, but no easy solution presented itself. Snips, on the other hand, seemed to pull himself together, turning around and taking a few steps. "Come on!" he called to her. "We can't continue the play now. We've got to tell the others." Cheerilee felt a block of ice drop into her stomach as the scion colt galloped off. No, if he reached anybody else, he would... With a sudden burst of speed that had dazzled even Rainbow Dash, she rushed forward, catching up to the younger pony in mere seconds. In one fluid movement, she slipped from a full gallop into a full-blown karate kick, focusing all her kinetic energy in a single hoof. Snips got hit in the side, so good in fact that the kick sent him crashing into a nearby wall, at the bottom of which he fell down in a crumpled heap. Cheerilee silently thanked Rainbow Dash for all the time she'd come to give the kids some karate lessons. Some of it had obviously stuck in her head over the years. Before the colt could do more than roll onto his back, Cheerilee descended upon him like a Hulk. Before the colt could do more than roll on his back, Cheerilee descended upon him like a hawk, keeping him down with one hoof as she started beating him in the face with the other, in the throes of blind rage. Here was one who stood between her and reaching her goal, and she could think of nothing but removing him from her path right away, no matter the cost. Snips feebly tried to defend himself, but he was a lot smaller than the mare, not to mention a unicorn until she had all the physical powers of an earth pony to fall back on. The beating continued mercilessly, Snip's face swelling up and blood running out of his nose and down from the places where she broke through skin. In an act of desperation, the subconscious part of his mind reached out to magical reserves he didn't even think he had, and his horns started to glow green with power. All of a sudden, a wave of arcane energy zipped past Cheerilee's head, leaving a long, thin cut stretching the length of her cheek. The fuchsia-colored mare gasped in surprise as blood started trickling down from the wound, which wasn't all that serious, although it did sting a little. Her gaze dropped down to the colt's cutie mark, as she realized she would have seen this coming. His specialty obviously involved cutting of some kind, and apparently he wasn't restricted to the use of scissors. A subtle change in the aura around the horn warned Cheerilee that another spell was about to be flung at her, so with no other option in her mind, she raised her hoof before ramming it down to dish out another punch. Only this time, she didn't aim for Snip's face, but for the horn itself. As she hit her target, the colt's head jerked back as he groaned. As the horn tugged at his skull, the spell discharging into the wall behind him instead of its intended target. The magical light around the horn flickered for a moment before coming back in force, and Cheerilee just knew the next spell was already on its way. So once again she rained down punches, now aiming all of them at the horn, spells exploding against the walls, ceiling, and floor left and right, sending tiny pieces of rubble flying everywhere. At first the colt took the beatings like a stallion, but as the mare hit the same spot time and time again, it became increasingly difficult for him to fight back against the pain that was rising in his skull. All of a sudden, little cracks started to appear in the horn, until one final strike from Cheerilee broke it clear off. When that happened, magic exploded into the room, throwing Cheerilee off the colt and making her slide several meters over the floor, until she came to a halt a few meters away from Snips. The magical feedback seemed to have been a lot worse for the Scion pony himself, as he lay witlessly on the floor. Scrambling to her hooves, the fuchsia mare picked up Snip's horn when she pressed past it on the way to his motionless form, clutching it between her front hooves like a dagger as she kneeled over him. With a moment's hesitation, she rammed the horn straight down into his chest. Blood splattered everywhere and welled up underneath Cheerilee's hooves. The cold eyes shot open as he stared first at his chest, and then at her. "Why?" he managed to whisper hoarsely as life fled from his body. Cheerilee didn't bother to answer his question, simply pulling the horn out of his body and ramming it back into his chest a few times for good measure, until he stopped moving altogether. Cheerilee panted heavily from actual physical exertion this time, as she rolled off of Snip's corpse, trying to catch her breath as she just lay on the cold floor. Killing him like this had been quite exhilarating in its own right, even if it did all end rather fast. She licked over her own cheek, sampling her own blood for the first time, and finding it not altogether pleasant, even if it did feel a bit strange. She was glad she'd been able to try this struggle for survival approach at least once, though. Even if her original plan for Apple Bloom and him had been 1,000 times more elegant. The realization suddenly hit her with a sickening force. Her plans for Snips and Apple Bloom. The plan required both of them to maneuver each other into the right places, and even after that, the next few steps also required interaction between them. Now that Snips was gone, it couldn't possibly work. And that was the least of her troubles. The play still had one scene to go, and Snips was supposed to be in it. The mare began to think up countless new plans on the spot, but she rejected all of them out of hand for being too ridiculous, too short-sighted, too dangerous, too risky. She began to fear the situation was hopeless, that she had finally maneuvered herself into a corner she could not escape from. To keep the audience in the dark, the final scene had to go without a hitch, so someone had to go out there and play against Apple Bloom. With nobody else left from the original cast, she could only count on herself. She'd have to improvise, and it probably would not work, but it was the best shot she had, the only shot she had. She quickly galloped towards the dressing area and headed in the back room, wiping the blood off of herself with a rag before opening the chest that held Reginald's final costume. It was way too small for her, of course, but it included a partially dashing brooch she could use as a fastener. Cheerilee quickly picked up the brooch and continued on towards the back of the room, where several bolts of clay lay stashed. Where several bolts of cloth lay stashed. She chose a black piece that was just large enough to fit her on her body and swung over her back, using the brooch as a clasp in her neck to end up with something vaguely reminiscent of a hooded cloak. It wouldn't hold up to scrutiny, but since the audience would only see her from far away, it might just do. At least, she hoped so. As a finishing touch, she slid a knife she found on a nearby shelf through the fabric, improvising some manner of sheath, so that the blade rested against her chest relatively hidden. The mare then dashed off to the direction of the stage, realizing she had no time left to waste. She brought up a mental map of the building on the fly to figure out exactly where she had to go. For the next scene, Reginald was supposed to emerge out of the mountain's cave after the king had climbed up that mountain to meet his challenge. Knowing that, Cheerilee rounded a turn and rushed up a flight of stairs, emerging at last into the dark cave at the top of the mountain. From here, she could see the audience, but she was quite sure the darkness still hid her from them. Judging from the fact that Apple Bloom was nowhere in sight, she had made it in time. She quietly congratulated herself over this accomplishment, as she took a few moments to catch her breath and rest up, fearing that she may soon need the energy. It only took her a minute to start hearing the filly's voice come closer. Pretty soon after that she came into view, making her way up the mountain slope. She was wearing relatively simple attire compared to the royal mantle from earlier. She had a sheathed toy sword with her, attached to her side where she could easily reach for the pommel with her teeth. "Reginald, I have come to face your challenge. Come out and fight like a stallion," King Golden Crown roared, looking around defiantly. Cheerilee took one deep breath and hid her face a bit deeper under the hood, even though she wasn't sure why. It wouldn't fool anyone, or not for very long at least. Swallowing back her fear, she stepped out of the cave and onto the highest point of the stage. The mountain summit was located several meters above the mine Scootaloo had disappeared into earlier. But as it was placed all the way to the back of the stage, even the ponies occupying the first rows could still see the actors up there relatively easily. Cheerilee could hear the crowd talking and whispering to each other as she stepped out of the shadows. They were obviously wondering what in the hay she was doing up there on stage. Apple Bloom herself was even more confused. She had expected to see Snips there, not her teacher. "Miss Cheerilee, what are you—" she began to say quietly. "I see you have come, O brave king, and I applaud your bravery. As a token of my respect, I shall face you here in my one true form. Up till now, witchcraft and sorcery have hidden me from your eyes, but no longer. Tonight, we fight an honest battle." Cheerilee's voice boomed through the complex, easily going over Apple Bloom's. The explanation sounded tacky even in her own ears, but it was the best she'd able to come up with at such a short notice. In a sudden movement of inspiration, she gave Apple Bloom a conspirator's wink, praying the filly would play along. Whatever the filly had assumed Cheerilee meant by it, she suddenly nodded eagerly, as if to say, "Oh, I got it."
"Oh, fiend, I knew there was more afoot when you bested my most trusted advisers. Witchcraft, this explains a lot indeed,"
the king responded, Apple Bloom's accent playing up slightly as she strayed from the original script. But the fuchsia mare couldn't have cared less at that point. So relieved was she to see the other pony playing along with her ruse.
"Well then, let us dance,"
she cried out as she reached her right hoof under her cloak to draw the knife, keeping 3 hoofs on the floor as she pointed her blade at her opponent. The filly in turn took the pommel of her sword between her teeth and assumed a combative stance. The sword was far too big for her to carry in a hoof, as Cheerilee did with her knife, as for this was the only option. That alone made the odds heavily favor for the mare, and on top of that, one of them was wielding a real knife, while the other one had only mostly harmless plastic toy. The entire fighting scene had been carefully choreographed, so Apple Bloom naturally stuck to her predetermined moves, and she expected Cheerilee to play by the book as well. Cheerilee would certainly have been capable of doing so had she been so inclined, since she was the one who planned out the entire thing. She was, however, extremely anxious to get it all over with quickly. As soon as Apple Bloom advanced, Cheerilee stepped forward as well, intentionally allowing herself to go within reach of the filly's sword. Instead of parrying Apple Bloom's swing with her dagger as the filly expected, she jerked her head back to dodge it, confusing the hay out of Apple Bloom and throwing her balance off completely. The fuchsia mare quickly followed up with an attack of her own, which left a nasty cut over the filly's left cheek, almost the twin of the cut Cheerilee still had under her hood. Apple Bloom let out a sharp cry, more out of surprise than out of pain, as she stumbled backwards. She looked at the red liquid dripping down from the tip of the knife, and then at Cheerilee, who stared back coldly from underneath the hood.
"Wait, is that a real—"
she began saying, the words muffled a little by the pommel in her mouth. But Cheerilee didn't at all feel like letting down the pressure now and simply rushed forward. Apple Bloom panicked and swung her sword, hitting Cheerilee right in the face in the process. Cheerilee almost lost her balance as her head got slammed to the side, but somehow she had managed to turn the movement into an 80-degree spin, bucking her hind legs at the filly. She hit her right in the chest, and the sheer force of the blow sent the little one flying across the stage until she landed roughly on her back a meter or two away. The filly took a deep breath, a stinging pain in her chest altering her to the fact that all was not well. She didn't seem to be able to draw in as much air as usual either. She realized Cheerilee had probably broken some of her ribs, and still felt dazed from the landing too. Her teacher, however, wasted no time descending upon the fallen Apple Bloom like a vulture, ramming the knife through her right shoulder and into the wooden floor below, effectively pinning her down. The filly held back a shriek of pain and swung her sword again, hitting Cheerilee in the head once more. It barely fazed the mare, although it did piss her off. All of a sudden she brought her head down and head-butted the filly brutally, hoping to knock her out. And that was exactly what happened as Apple Bloom's eyes rolled back into her head. Suddenly becoming aware of the audience staring up at her, Cheerilee remembered her last lines, the words traditionally spoken at the end of Reginald's play. Even though she'd have to change it up a bit. She clutched her head as if she had been fatally wounded by that last blow, and then spoke dramatically.
Oh, what a cruel fate! Now we both must die, but I implore you all, stallions and mares, to never forget Reginald the Sly.
And then she allowed herself to fall to the floor, remaining there motionless. She'd never understood those words herself, or what more or less they were supposed to convey, but they got the job done. The technician got the cue, and the curtain started to close as the audience started to stomp their hooves down onto the floor and cheer to show their approval. The play had been, on the whole, pretty well done, and the curious alternate ending did add the certain something. Not to mention the last fighting scene had been gorgeous. It didn't look like they were pretending at all. With relief, Cheerilee saw the curtain finally close completely, hiding the stage from the audience's sight. She'd spread the word that the fillies and herself would have to start breaking down the stage props and cleaning up the backstage area right away, since some other group from Canterlot needed the building later that week. That meant nobody was expecting them home anytime soon. She threw a glance at the unconscious filly next to her, who still had the knife embedded in her shoulder, and smiled. She had all the time she needed to figure out something new for this one now. All the time in the world. Applebloom, in her half-awake state, suddenly felt a cold glass being pressed against her lips. She instinctively opened her mouth to drink, quickly swallowing what she believed to be water. It only took her a few sips to realize, even in her groggy state, that what she was drinking wasn't water at all. For one, it had a sort of metallic aftertaste, and for another, there were small bits and pieces in it that sort of resembled. At once, she was wide awake, coughing and spitting out the last of the fluid in her mouth. She'd been bound to some sort of wooden table with leather straps. She saw Cheerilee sitting next to her, holding a glass filled with red liquid, grinning wickedly at her.
I thought you'd like it. Scootaloo made it herself, you know. She really poured herself into it, you could say.
The mare cackled maniacally as horror flashed across the filly's face.
Scootaloo? You, killed her? Oh yes, afraid so. She was the first to go, you know. And you're the last.
The mare said, feeling uncharacteristically chatty. The filly turned pale.
You killed all of them? Oh, goodness, no,
she replied, grinning as relief spread over the filly's face.
I didn't kill Snails. That was all you. The way you made that spotlight, or sun if you wish, fall down on him. Glorious.
Tears filled Applebloom's eyes as the realization hit her that all of her friends were gone, and that her fate wasn't likely to be any different.
Why?
She managed to let out as Cheerilee picked up a knife and held it up to the light appraisingly.
Why? Because you all deserve it. Each and every one of you is a blight upon this land, a weed in my garden, and it's time to end it.
The mare said coldly as she positioned herself at the end of the table, near the filly's hind legs.
So shall we?
Slowly and carefully, the mare made an incision above the filly's hoof, cutting neatly around the circumference of her leg. Applebloom tried to squirm, but the leather straps effectively held her in place as they dug into her skin. Cheerilee slipped the knife under her skin, carefully cutting the skin loose from the filly's flesh. The pain this caused was immense, but the filly clenched her teeth and refused to acknowledge it. Every bit as stubborn as her sister was, not wanting to give Cheerilee the pleasure of hearing her scream. Cheerilee obviously thought she cut enough for now, as she took hold of the flap of skin she cut loose with her teeth. Slowly she pulled it up the filly's legs, ripping more skin off as she went, filleting the filly alive. Despite her brave effort, this was simply too much for any pony to endure, and Applebloom's scream rang throughout the empty complex. Cheerilee continued making new incisions every time she accidentally tore the skin off completely, and then continued the filleting from there. Pretty soon, half of the filly's leg was a bloody heap of bare flesh, every little twitch going through the exposed muscles, an agonizing experience, blood dropping from everywhere. But still, Cheerilee showed no sign of stopping, as she continued to cut and fillet, slowly moving up. Eventually, the filly's entire leg was a disgusting, skinless mess. Cheerilee sadistically breathed out on it for a while, making Applebloom shiver in pain. A little light sparkled in Cheerilee's eyes as she bowed down and extended her tongue, slowly dragging it all the way from the filly's hoof up to her flank. For a moment, the mare thought the screams that followed would deafen her permanently before she pulled her tongue back into her mouth and savored the taste. You're quite good. Wanna taste?" she whispered in the filly's ear. Fuck you!" the cutie mark crusader managed to stammer. Cheerilee laughed, amused by Applebloom's defiant nature. This one may be able to take some punishment yet. She diligently started cutting up the filly's other leg, making a long incision across the length of the leg this time, pulling the skin off towards the sides instead of upwards. The filly still tried to resist and keep up appearances, but she slowly started sobbing and shivering as the pain became too much to bear. Her breathing became ragged, and her skin turning pale as her vividly scarlet blood coated the floor. As she gained more confidence with the knife, her movements started to become quicker, and in one fluid motion, she first cut the skin from the filly's left flank, and then moved right over to cut the skin on the right. She picked up the two pieces of the skin with her teeth and held them up before the filly, before tossing them aside. "Saw those? That's where your cutie marks would have been. If you had one. You will never know now. Guess your crusading days are over." This realization finally did the pain hadn't been able to. This realization finally did what the pain hadn't been able to do. It shattered the filly's last vestiges of resistance. From one moment to the next, she started to cry loudly, her body shaking wildly, using up way more energy on all of that than she should. Cheerilee started cutting out strips of skin on the filly's chest until the word weed was spelled out there. By now the filly had lost enough blood and wasted enough energy that her response started to become sluggish, ruining some of Cheerilee's fun. She tried poking the knife into a few pressure points, but her reaction was so underwhelming that Cheerilee shrugged and decided to call it quits. She undid the leather straps and pulled the tub out from under the table. The exact same one she had squeezed Scootaloo out into earlier. And Scootaloo was still there. Not wanting to simply wait until Applebloom bled out, the mare pulled her off the table by her mane, dropping her straight into the tub. The blood and pieces of gore suddenly surrounding her stung on her bare flesh, and she let out a soft hiss. As Apple Bloom took in the scent of blood and saw an eye drifting slowly by, she suddenly realized just what she'd been dropped in. This notion seemed to renew her strength as she scrambled to get out of the tub, but Cheerilee was having none of it. She grabbed the filly by the mane with a hoof and forced her down into the pool of blood, keeping her mouth and nostrils under. The filly screamed, swallowing mouthfuls of scootaloo in the process as she thrashed her legs about wildly, splattering the contents of the tub everywhere. Air bubbled up from her mouth, but Cheerilee kept her there firmly, ecstatic to see the filly struggling die down slowly. As Apple Bloom's lungs started to burn more, she involuntarily tried to breathe anyway, filling her lungs with blood and gore. After a last erratic twitch of one of her legs, Apple Bloom remained motionless. The fuchsia-colored mare waited for a few more seconds before releasing the filly. Apple Bloom's mutilated body just kept laying still in the pool of blood that had once been scootaloo, and Cheerilee knew her task had finally come to an end. All that was left was simply clean up. She sat back and cried tears of joy, overcome with emotion, as she realized she might finally get her life back on the rails now, with a new class next year, a class of nice fillies and colts, instead of the monsters she had had. She felt proud to have played her part in making Equestria a better place. Proud to have protected the future generations from poisonous influences that would have hampered their growth, which in turn would have hampered others. The consequences would have been quite dear, to say the least. Humming a cheerful tune, she went to get cleaned up once again, and then went over to the stash of flammable liquids. It'd take some time by herself, but she'd get the job done. She felt like she was walking on clouds. Nothing would stop her now. Fire sprang up all around her, stopping her right in her tracks. She realized too late she had not thought this through. She'd spread flammable stuff everywhere and then lit a few fires in different places. She had underestimated the speed at which the flames would spread. And now here she was, not too far from the exit, but unable to proceed due to the problem she had herself created. She backed off into the center of the room, as far away from the flames as possible, but as soon as she got there, she already had to jump out of the way of a burning crossbeam, which had only barely missed her. Various patches of her fur on her body were already singed from the flames she barely dodged, and soot and ash covered her from tip to hoof. Smoke started to fill the room, and Cheerilee felt herself slowly suffocating as every breath she took drew some more of it into her lungs. As her breath became troubled, she laughed softly, wondering if her day of liberation would also be the day she died. She consoled herself that a noble death, after having completed her mission, was still infinitely better than the life she had been living before. In a world where those colts and fillies were still alive. Just as she started to think the situation was hopeless, a burst of purple light exploded from the exit outside, wood splintering in the explosion. Surprisingly, the blast must have sucked the life out of most of the flames between her and the exit, so summoning the last of her strength, Cheerilee made a beeline for the exit. As she got closer, she could hear voices talking to each other urgently, worry thick in their voices.